Such a pleasure to get to be with you again. For those of you who are visiting, my name is John. I am from the Wildercroft congregation, and I too am a visitor. And so I get the pleasure of every so often getting to come and spend some time with you guys and really enjoying some Old Testament studies as we go through the book of Judges. We'll be in Judges chapter 4 this morning, and we'll be going through the story of Debra. I really appreciate everyone's kind attention and efforts and turning along and following along with me over the last several weeks as we've been studying the book of Judges. Lord willing, we will study the historical account in Judges 4 today, and then next week we'll take a look at the song of Debra and Barak in chapter 5. Both are kind of connected, but I think chapter 5 deserves some time and attention on its own because it's a whole chapter based on the prayers and songs of victory thanks to the obedience in God. And there are many, many songs like that through the Old Testament, particularly that of Moses and others. And I think, spending some time looking at, some praise and some worship of God after a victory is something unique. So today we're going to look at the historical, events that would go on in Deborah's life, Deborah and Barak, and their deliverance against the Canaanites. But before we get into the chapter, let's just do a recap because I've slept since the last time I was here, and I'm sure, maybe we've forgotten a couple of things. But Judges is a book spanning about 400 years of time. And it's covering from when Joshua and the people of Israel would enter the land of Canaan, conquer most of it, and unfortunately we find out from chapter 1 that they left some nations. And now God is going to use those nations to test Israel. And Israel often falls prey to the sins, and we go through a cycle where the people are faithful for a little while they have a spiritual leader, and then after that leader leaves or dies, they become less and less faithful, and eventually they get to the point where God has no choice but to sell them into the hands of their enemies. And it can be really easy for us, aka me, to sit back and be a little bit judgmental and be like, what were you thinking? You suffered for 20 years just because you didn't want to return to God? But the reality is I do the same thing. We do the same thing. We have the little sins in our lives that we don't get rid of right away and have this covenant relationship with God now that could have so many benefits and blessings, but we trade them for the less superior things. We trade the creation for the creator, and it's a sad state of affairs. So it's really easy to look at these people and be like, what were you thinking? But we can't fall prey to that. So last time I was with you, we studied the first 3 judges: Othniel, which was a descendant of Caleb, Ehud, and Shamgar. And so we're going to pick up literally almost right after those events, after the death of Ehud, and we'll find out in chapter 5 that Shamgar is going to kind of be at the same point in time that all of this is going down, but all of these events are happening in rapid succession. Geographically, where we're looking at is going to be the northwest side of the land of Canaan. It's going to be up more towards the Turkey side of everything going on here. And we'll see a lot of events that are going to come back in retro history here in just a few moments. So let's jump into Judges in the 4th chapter, and let's read the chapter before we get started. And the people of Israel did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazar. The commander of his armies was Sisera, and he lived in Hesherabah Hagaman. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now Debra, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Debra between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abaniah, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, "Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded you? Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, gather 10,000 of the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun." And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you, and by the river Kishon, and his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. And Barak said, I will go. If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, surely I will go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, but will lead to the Lord's. So the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Debra arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out of Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his heel, and Debra went with him. Now Hebron the Kenite had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, And he pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zamin, which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told to Barak and the son of Abinadab had gone to Mount Tabor, Sisera called his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men that were with him from Hadash Hagrim to the river Kishon. And Debra said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go before you? So Barak went down to the Mount Tabor with 10,000 of his men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and his chariots and all the army before Barak by the edge of the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Harugim, and the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left, but Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera, and told him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, and do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened up a skin of milk and gave him to drink and covered him. And he said to her, stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you and says, is anyone here, just say no. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and a hammer in her hand, and when she went in softly to him and drove the peg in through his temple until it went down into the ground, while he was laying fast asleep from weariness, so he died. And behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said, come, and I will show you the man in which you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with the tent peg in his temple. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel oppressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. So we read in this example, or in this text here, the historical story of Debra. And we come to find out that Jabin, the king of Canaan, has been oppressing the people of Israel for nearly 20 years. And this is kind of an interesting story because this is the exact name of a king and exact city in which Joshua would destroy in Joshua chapter 11. But that's been about 120 years from now, and this king rises back up, rebuilds kind of a confederacy of Canaanite territories, and is now using them as an oppression tool against the people of Israel. Now, when Joshua was called into the land to destroy the Canaanites, there was a very, very specific reason. And the reason given, without being too graphic, was that they valued human life at zero. They would sacrifice their infant children on the open arms of a metal idol, heated up internally. And Cicero, one of the Greek historians, would record that they would beat their drums louder at that time to drown out the screaming cries of the children. So they absolutely did not care for the life and the sanctity of life that God had been given them. And according to Joshua, they had 400 years to correct that behavior. God had been giving them instruction. We're not privy to what that was, but they had been given instruction to stop these practices. And so in Joshua 11, he comes in and destroys all of these cities, sets Hebron on fire, and yet 120 years later, these people have rebuilt. They've restructured. And we find out from Judges chapter 1, one of the reasons they were able to do this is because, well, the people of Israel didn't finish the job. They didn't clear out the land. They didn't finish putting all of these Canaanites, all these people who were in exact opposition to everything that they should have had as a moral value, completely out of the land. So we find now, or we come into this story after the people of Israel have been handed over to Jabin, handed over to these Canaanites, this prophetess, Debra. And we get a very rare glimpse into prophetess, the female prophetess. There's actually only 5 that we know of in the Bible, and I would think that there are more, but we're not given that information. 4 of them are what we would consider faithful, and 1 in Revelations is unfaithful, 3 being in the Old Testament, and then Anna in the New Testament. But these were women of faith that would talk to God, that were given specific instructions from God. And quite a pleasure that is. But also what's interesting about Debra as a judge is she's the first actual judge, what we would consider a judge. The previous men, the word used there for a judge would have been the Hebrew word safat. They were military leaders. They came in and they served a military purpose. Whereas Debra is actually a more legal judge. The people were coming to her at the Palms of Debra, which was probably a grove or an area which she would set up a tent and kind of, hold court, if you will. But she was an actual judge, which is kind of interesting. So not only did she talk with God, but she had a mind that the people respected and gave legal decisions based on what she would see as the information available to her. And one day she calls Barak. And I find it interesting that, Barak is going to be listed in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, as a man of faith. He makes what we call sometimes the Hall of Fame of faith. And yet, when she calls him, it almost is an accusatory manner. She says, didn't God say to go out and, take these 2 tribes, raise an army, and get rid of the Canaanites? And his response is pretty interesting. I'll go if you come with me. And if you don't come with me, I'm not going. And I love her response. I love her faith. It almost seems like, I pictured in my mind, maybe incorrectly or maybe correctly, that, as he's saying this, she's like kind of getting up, packing her bag. And she says, surely I'll go. And she's ready. She's ready absolutely to follow this man into battle because God said so. And it's quite a wonderful message of faith that this woman who, we may not expect, especially seeing so many male leaders in the Bible, that she just steps up and says, okay, I'm ready to go. Let's do this. God said it. I'm ready to follow and obey. So we see that she leaves her territory. Barak goes to Naphtali and Zebulun and says, okay, let's go. Let's get together an army. And he gets together an army, and they go down to the valley of Kishon, near the river there. And again, this is all in far northwest Israel, that we would consider Israel today. And when they get there, they get this army. They seem to be energetic because they say that the army is on the heels of Barak. So they're ready. They're ready to go. But when they get there, Debra still has to encourage, still has to get them, kind of up and at them to get moving. When she says, go, get up, gather your men, has the Lord not gone out before you? Is this not the will of God? She's trying to reinforce and re-encourage him. Hey, wait a second. Okay, you've done good so far. You've gotten half the battle. Now it's time to get going. Now it's time to continue on and pursuing this mission that you've been given by God. And I think often we men are really good at getting started. We're really good at getting the army together. And once we have the army together, we kind of sit back on our thumbs and our laurels, and we think, okay, we're good now. And Deborah and the women around us are like, no. You got to go finish the job. You can't just halfway do this. This has got to be done. This has got to be completed, and it's got to be completed the way God does. And the faith of Barak is not something that we want to completely denote. I don't want to paint him in a completely bad picture. Yeah, his first statement is definitely one of kind of mixed feelings, but he knows, according to the prophecy that Deborah is going to give him, that this isn't for his own glory. He's not going to get all the praise and acclaim. He is told that a woman is going to be the deliverer of Israel. And I wondered, honestly, as I read through this, if Deborah knows that this isn't her. Does Deborah really know that this is another woman, or does she think that she has another role to play? I have no idea. But still, that doesn't seem to make her even second guess herself. She just goes. She's just ready to engage and initiate the battle. Now, it's mentioned here twice, and it's also mentioned in Judges that this Canaanite group had chariots. And here it's denoted particularly, not only did they have 900 chariots, but they had chariots made of iron. And so there's a lot of speculation there of what that could be, and I don't want to get into the weeds of that too far. But if we take this into more modern military, a better maybe comparison for us would be to think of these chariots as tanks and the people of Israel as guys with wooden pitchforks. It's that kind of a comparison. These devices of war were really, really good at cutting down your enemies. They were really good at destroying forces. They could move fast. They could, get you into a position which you could be tactically have the tactical advantage. And yet, Barak and Deborah are still going up to battle. Nothing has changed at all. And why are they going up to battle? Because God said so. Deborah even makes the comment, does not the Lord, does not Yahweh, this God who we have a relationship with, doesn't he go out before us? Doesn't he strike our enemy down? And so with 10,000 men, they're going to take on 900 chariots of iron, and how many ever men were with those of the Canaanites. And we know from other chapters, as well as some historical context, that these would have been more than just one city, but really would have been a conglomerate of many, many different armies or many different tactics that would have been used against the people of Israel. This is a very well-trained, well-prepared army, and the Israelites may have been just, farmers with pitchforks. We're not talking a talented, well-trained army. These are people who, have a day job, if you will, that are being brought up into the service of God and are going to be used by God to deliver the people of Israel. And so they get together and they go and they have the battle, and thanks to the Lord, everyone is slain. Every single person, except for Sisera, at the battle loses their life. And God gives them a victory. But Barak knows that if you don't cut off the head, the rest of the snake will, be a significant problem. And so he goes and he's continually pursuing Sisera. And here we find another woman of faith. And we'll know more about her next week when we study chapter 5. But she's a woman of faith that believes in God. And while her family, the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, are not at war with the Canaanites, she herself considers that, their atrocities and the instructions given by God are worth following. And so she'll allow Sisera to come in. She encourages it. She says, hey, turn aside, come here, hide, take care of yourself. I'll give you something, to satisfy your stomach. I'll take care of you. And then she comes in with, a stake and, a hammer. And she literally nailed it. Nailed Sisera to the ground. And I find her faith there very interesting. And while Deborah definitely, stands out as a leader of faith, I think Jael's faith here too is really something that we can't overlook. her family and that of the Canaanites are not enemies. She is literally risking war with her family and those are the people surrounding them to take this stand and this action against the people that are oppressing the children of Israel. And so she literally is risking everything to serve God. And next chapter and next week, we'll get a little bit more detail about some of that. And the song of praise by Debra and Barak as they're singing to God, as they're praying, and as they're giving thanks for this woman who, plays a very small role, but yet a huge fundamental role in getting rid of the leadership of the Canaanite people. And because of that, we'll read down at the end of the chapter that this encourages the people of Israel to press harder and harder and harder on Jabin, the king of the king of the Canaanites, and eventually they yield and are destroyed. So in this chapter, we find that there are three really big players. We have Debra, Barak, and Jael. Debra, being a prophetess, directly given instruction and information by God. Barak getting, secondhand information directly from God, but having to take faith on that. And then Jael, which we don't know that received any instruction from God, but knows what is right, knows what she should be doing based on the actions of the people around her, and takes faith. And a couple of takeaways from this lesson this morning that I really want us to kind of pay attention to is that of the role of women in spiritual leadership. We think far too often as people who get up here are the spiritual leaders. The people who stand up in front of everyone and get to talk, yes, it's a lot of fun, but it's not necessarily spiritual leadership. It's what I would consider the single pew mom who wrangles 4 kids or 5 kids every single Sunday and Wednesday to make sure that they're in the pew and they're learning and they're talking about God. That's spiritual leadership. It might be quiet, it might be hidden, but it's still leadership. And these women are a great example of doing what is right, even when it's 1, unpopular, and 2, not necessarily, going to bring them any glory or honor. We look at many congregations in this country and as well as all over the world, and I've visited many of them, and you come in and you see so many what I would consider single pew moms or single women in the pew. And it's not because they're really single, it's because their husband isn't, here, or their children aren't here, because they don't have an interest in God's will. And yet the women are still here. It reminds me of the story of Dorcas in the New Testament. When she would die and the apostles would be called, the women that would surround her and that were mourning for her were holding up articles of clothing that she had made for them. That's spiritual leadership in a really tangible way. It's the meals, it's the words of encouragement, it's the cards, it's the prayers, and it's the many other things that the women do, and even guys, but particularly women here, that are spiritual leadership. And we cannot forget, nor even for a second entertain the idea that God doesn't find these women super important. Because given the example that we have at least 4 prophetess in the Bible that we know of that were faithful to God, God found it important to talk to them. While we may have different roles, these women were given direct command and had direct communication with God. And so in the New Testament, while we have different roles, while we have different positions that each of us play, women are still very much so spiritual leaders. They're very still much so part of what God wanted for his people. And second is that sometimes it's okay to show a little bit of trepidation. Barak said, "I'll go if you go. I'll be okay if you're with me." We're allowed to do that. We're allowed sometimes to really sit back and say, okay, wait a second, what really should I be doing? Is this the right course of action? I don't believe that necessarily completely without faith, but he needed reinforcement. And we today still need reinforcement. That's why we're literally here. We're called to assemble together, to reinforce each other, to encourage each other, and that's exactly the point. We're not alone in all of this, and when we start acting like we are, or start thinking that we are, we've become easy prey for the pickings. And unfortunately, the devil loves when we think we're okay or alone, rather than taking a moment to pause and gather our forces together. There's a lot of really beautiful analogies that we could draw from these people of faith. We're going to spend more time specifically at the songs in chapter 5 that will be sung based on the victories that come in God, that come at the hand of God. For today, we can never forget, one, that we all have a role to play in leadership, and that two, we all have each other to support each other. We all have the ability to draw closer to each other and to God. If there are those in this audience this morning who have something in which their lives which really isn't copacetic with God, don't wait. The children of Israel waited 20 years in this instance, and we've seen in other places where they waited 8 or 10 years to get rid of the sin that was enslaving them. You know, Hebrews would talk about, let us lay aside the sin and the weight that so easily encumbers us and run the race that is set before us. Now, we're not running alone. We can help each other. We're called to help each other. If you've not put on Christ, we talked in class about the second death. It's a real thing, and it's a permanent thing. Once we leave this earth, it's over. But while we have breath, while we have ability, we can make a choice. We can choose to follow God. If you have any needs this morning, will you please come forward as we stay on the song that's been selected.